Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we dig into centuries of financial history, unpack the strategies of these global giants, and decode the real playbooks of the power brokers shaping our world. Our sources for this deep dive are, well, they're pretty panoramic. We're looking across time, from the 19th century barons, the oil guys, all the way up to today's private equity titans, AI architects, and the founders building these huge corporate cultures. The mission today is really focused. We're not just counting money. We're trying to find those common, sometimes pretty ruthless strategies these empires use to get real global influence over, well, everything, commerce, governance, the lot.
Exactly. And setting the stage, I think, is maybe the most crucial part of this whole thing. What we're looking at here isn't just business success, it's the actual architecture of, well, empire building.
Empire building.
Yeah, we're digging into the philosophies underneath it all, the financial setups, the political games they play. And what's really fascinating, truly, is how these core strategies just keep popping up. This hunger for massive scale, the long-term view that kind of ignores short-term profits, even sometimes conventional morality. These things stick around, even when the industry changes completely from, say, steel to silicon.
It's definitely a study in extremes, isn't it? You get this incredible strategic patience, like decades long, but then mixed with this immediate, almost brutal focus on getting things done, that internal drive. So
Okay.
our first section dives right into that core, the founder's mind and the unique and often really tough cultures they build around themselves.
Okay, so let's start with the blueprint, the unconventional strategy. Look, these huge companies, they're almost never built by just following the rules, right?
Yeah.
The founders who get to that level, they nearly always have some kind of counterintuitive idea about what really makes things tick, and they build the entire company around it. Take Sam Walton.
Hmm.
Seems simple, Walmart's rise, but
Yeah, Walton feels almost folksy, doesn't he? The old pickup truck story and all that. But his actual philosophy, it wasn't folksy at all. It was super strategic and, like our sources show, incredibly focused inward on the company itself.
precisely. Walton's big worry, the thing that kept him up at night, it wasn't the stock price, not really. It wasn't the market buzz. It was much more fundamental. Was he failing to look after the customers? Or maybe even more importantly for him, was he failing to look after his associates, his employees? He was obsessed with keeping that team concept alive because he knew deep down that everything depended on how well every single person executed their job.
And that internal focus, it led to specific rules, didn't it? Rules for how they grew, rules that kind of flew in the face of, standard business thinking. Like Rule 9, that sounds absolutely fundamental.
Oh, Rule 9 was non-negotiable. Control your expenses better than your competition. Period. This wasn't just advice, it was, like you said, an obsession.
Yeah.
Our sources actually confirm Walmart was number one, literally number one in the industry, for the lowest expense-to-sales ratio for 25 years straight. I mean, think about the cushion that gives you.
25 years is incredible discipline.
It is. Walton figured, look, you can mess up strategically sometimes, maybe pick the wrong product, stumble on an expansion plan. But if you run the absolute leanest, most efficient operation in the whole sector, you can always bounce back. That operational edge basically became their competitive moat.
Okay, so there's the iron discipline. But then you have Rule 10, which sounds totally different. Swim upstream, ignore what everyone else is doing. How do those two fit together? Efficiency and basically nonconformity.
Yeah, it seems contradictory, but it was about encouraging aggressive, kind of scrappy behavior in the market. He didn't just want managers following procedures. He wanted them hunting for weaknesses, looking for unconventional angles. There's this great story, almost sounds made up, about their early ad strategy.
Oh, yeah.
Walton and his partner, Phil Green, they literally sit on the office floor with scissors and glue pots. They'd cut out competitor ads from the big city papers, Dallas, Little Rock, you name it, and just paste them together to make Walmart's own ads, like right then and there.
Seriously. Scissors and paste. For a company that became Walmart, that sounds like something you'd do in elementary school.
It does. But it was pure, aggressive, competitive intel. They weren't focused on fancy design. They were focused laser-like on what they called real hot prices. Anything to get people in the door. They'd run toothpaste for like 16 cents a tube.
16 cents. Wow.
The idea was simple. If your ad looks just like everyone else's, same products, same prices, why would anyone switch? By finding those genuinely rock-bottom prices and hammering them home in these basic ads, they drove traffic, they got conversions, they just completely ignored the polished, conventional ad game their bigger rivals were playing.
So it's this weird mix. extreme internal efficiency, but then this almost guerrilla-style market aggression. Okay, let's switch gears completely. Howard Hughes. Walton obsessed with saving pennies. Hughes seemed, well, famously indifferent to making a profit as long as he had what he called a high gross. What was that about?
Yeah, Hughes is a fascinating case study in how financial insulation can basically buy you strategic freedom.
Yeah.
His whole business philosophy, summed up, was high gross, not necessarily high profit. Now, to most people, that sounds like really bad business. Why wouldn't you want profit?
Right.
But high gross means huge revenue, massive scale, lots of activity. There's this telling moment when the CEO of his aircraft division back in the 60s was asked point blank, do you want this division to actually show a profit? And his answer was basically, I don't really care.
That sounds completely bonkers from a financial perspective, but there has to be a reason, a mechanism. How could he afford to run a giant aircraft company like it was, I don't know, a hobby?
The mechanism, that's the key. It was the Hughes Tool Company's oil tool division. That thing was a relentless cash cow. Just printed money reliably day in, day out. That steady stream of cash basically subsidized everything else.
His other ventures, the glamorous ones, the high-tech ones, the ones with political angles like the aircraft division, they could afford to prioritize growth, cutting-edge tech, sheer size, instead of worrying about the bottom line month to month.
So the aircraft division was almost like a huge privately funded research lab, or maybe a way to get political influence. Pretty much.
Yeah.
Subsidized entirely by oil money. The goal there wasn't profit margin. It was dominance, technological leadership, maybe access. The structure itself gave him that freedom.
That insulation is powerful. Okay, let's shift from financial structure to maybe psychological structure, because the founder often has to create these really intense, high-pressure internal environments, right?
Oh, absolutely. Look
Okay.
at Steve Jobs. He had this almost magnetic ability to create this intense esprit de corps, this team spirit. But his method was, well, it was rough. He'd famously tear people down with really harsh criticism, but then just as quickly build them back up, make them feel like the Macintosh project wasn't just work, it was this amazing mission. He used things like that retreat at Pajaro Dunes near Monterey to really cement that shared, almost religious belief in what they were doing. The sheer psychological pressure, that feeling of being on a world-changing quest, that's what held it together.
And Elon Musk seems to use a similar kind of pressure tactic, but maybe he creates the crisis externally more often.
Yeah, Musk definitely has a tendency to, let's say, manufacture drama. He'll deliberately kick off some kind of surge, announce a deadline that seems completely unrealistic, maybe even unnecessary, like Autonomy Day or stacking the Starship before it's ready. It forces the whole organization into this constant crisis mode.
Why do you do that?
The idea seems to be that this manufactured urgency makes teams push harder, faster, take bigger risks, maybe bend or break a few rules along the way. It's like a self-imposed stress test designed to speed up innovation and just get stuff done quicker than anyone thinks is possible.
But that kind of constant manufactured intensity, it feels like it could backfire badly. I mean, when the vision hits a wall, when the tech just isn't there yet, that pressure cooker must turn toxic fast. Which I guess brings us to the really dark side of this obsession, the Theranos example.
Theranos is absolutely the ultimate cautionary tale, isn't it? It shows how that visionary drive can mutate into fraud when the pressure gets too high. The founder created this environment where admitting failure was basically unthinkable. Our sources talk about specific instances inside the lab. People like Alan Beam, Erica Chung, they were told to split proficiency testing samples. Run the same sample on their own Edison machine and on standard commercial analyzers.
Compare the results.
Exactly. And the results were terrible. The Edison's readings differed markedly, especially for common tests like vitamin D. The tech just didn't work reliably.
So the core product was fundamentally flawed, but the founder kept pushing the vision, the story.
And lied about it publicly. Claimed at big tech conferences that the Edisons were only used for a tiny fraction of their tests, like 12 out of 250. But the whole company was built on this amazing mission. And when the mission turned out to be technically impossible, the pressure to keep up the facade led straight to, criminal fraud and a total ethical meltdown.
It's a chilling example. We see a different kind of failure, maybe less criminal, but still driven by unchecked vision, with Maurizio Gucci, right? He had this grand vision to restore the brand's prestige, but his spending and strategy seemed completely unmoored from financial reality.
Yeah, his time in charge was, frankly, disastrous and incredibly quick. Maurizio inherited a company that was actually making decent money, around $60 million in profit. In just a few short years, he drove it deep into the red, losing $60 million. People around him said he acted like a kid in a candy shop, just had to have everything immediately, showed no sense of priority in his spending.
Can you give us a sense of the scale of that mismanagement? What did he actually do?
Well, it was bold but reckless. Obsessed with prestige, he immediately slashed over $100 million in sales by just cutting all the cheaper, more accessible product lines, trying to make the brand super exclusive overnight. Okay, maybe a long-term goal. But then, at the exact same time, he added $30 million to the company's expenses right away, like luxurious new headquarters, vanity projects, just hemorrhaging cash.
Wow. Cut revenue, increase spending massively. Not a great combination.
Not at all. That drive, that vision for restoration, because it wasn't backed by any kind of realistic financial planning or operational discipline like Walton had, or the kind of financial buffer Hughes had. It just led to this massive self-inflicted financial implosion. It really proves that just having intense drive isn't enough. It can actually be incredibly destructive without the right structure around it.
Right, so the founder's psychology sets the tone, the culture, the risk tolerance. But building an empire, it needs more than just drive. It needs a really sophisticated grasp of capital.
Which brings us to the second big playbook, mastering leverage, timing, and understanding the whole financial structure of the game. And to really get the modern players, you actually have to look back a bit. Thomas Piketty's work on capital gives us this really crucial big picture view. He points out that the total value of capital stock today, think property, stocks, all that stuff, it adds up to maybe 5 or 6 years worth of national income in places like Britain or France. Now that sounds like a lot, but the kicker is it's getting close to the levels we saw right before World War I, which were more like 6 or 7 years of national income.
Whoa, hold on. So after everything in the 20th century, the wars, the depression, the rise of the middle class, we're basically back to Gilded Age levels of wealth concentration relative to what people actually earn.
That's the really stark takeaway. The ratio of capital to income has been climbing steadily since the 1950s. And what that means, practically, is that in this environment, just owning capital-owning assets that grow and generate returns gives you this huge compounding advantage over just earning a salary through work. The titans who really succeed today, they're the ones who figure out how to use debt, how to use influence, to control resources way beyond what they personally own.
And the original master of playing that game was John D. Rockefeller, right? Even though later in life he famously hated borrowing money, our sources say in his youth he was the greatest borrower you ever saw. He didn't just borrow. He understood the psychology of it.
Oh, his tactics were brilliant, pure psychological jujitsu. He totally understood how bankers thought, how crowds behave. Let's say he needed $5,000 to expand a refinery. A normal person might just go ask for a loan, maybe cap in hand. Not Rockefeller.
What did he do?
He'd strategically let rumors slip out around town that he was looking to invest $10,000 in some new project. Now, think about what that does. First, it signals to everyone, especially the bankers, that his company must be doing incredibly well. Great credit, right? Second, it creates this instant buzz, this sense of urgency and competition among the bankers.
So instead of him needing their money, they start thinking they need to get in on his action before he takes his supposed $10,000 somewhere else. They're competing to lend to him.
Exactly. He flipped the script completely. He made lending to him seem like a smart, desirable move for the banker, not just a risk they had to evaluate. It just shows how he saw the whole financial system, not as rules to follow, but as a game to be played, a system to manipulate to his advantage.
So Rockefeller mastered creating the demand for credit. Fast forward. And you get modern titans like Blackstone, who seem to have mastered the timing of using credit, especially that counter-cyclical thing.
Blackstone's whole model is basically built on this. Raise enormous pools of capital, sit on it, and then deploy it aggressively when everyone else is panicking or being forced to sell assets cheap. The data we looked at shows this really clear pattern. The buyouts they did when the economy was officially weak, troughs like 91, 92, or 2001, 2002, those deals generated average returns around 30%.
30%? That's huge.
It's roughly double the returns they got when they bought companies during boom times.
So they literally profit from downturns, from distress. When did this really put them ahead of the pack?
The period right after the dot-com crash and the credit crunch that followed, around 2003. While a lot of their rivals were still licking their wounds, hesitant, Blackstone just went on a buying spree. They started snapping up what our sources call big, chunky industrial assets. They signed deals worth a staggering $16.5 billion just that year. It perfectly demonstrated their strategy. Raise the money, wait patiently, then strike decisively when assets are cheap and fear is high.
But that strategy, relying on huge amounts of capital, often borrowed capital, extreme leverage, It's inherently risky, right? It feels like it could all collapse if the timing is just slightly off.
That's the constant sword hanging over private equity. The whole model depends heavily on the idea that the value of companies, the multiples people are willing to pay, will stay high or even go up. Our sources spell out the nightmare scenario. What if a company's earnings drop at the same time that the market decides companies in that sector are worth less, so the multiples shrink? That double whammy, they say, can just slice the value by a third, easily enough to wipe out all the equity the buyout firm put in. It requires not just good timing, but almost unshakable faith that markets will eventually recover or that they can fix the companies they buy.
And for these kinds of massive, highly leveraged deals to even be possible, the whole financial world had to change. Its culture had to change. The evolution of Morgan Stanley seems to capture that perfectly. Started out as this, stuffy, genteel underwriting house.
Yet Morgan Stanley's transformation through the 1970s really mirrored and maybe even drove a broader cultural shift on Wall Street. They ditched that old school gentlemanly banker image and just became fiercely competitive, aggressive. They famously undertook the first big hostile takeover raid of the modern era back in '74. They got really good at the sharp end of finance. Complex mergers, junk bonds, those leveraged buyouts we were just talking about.
So they weren't just adapting, they were kind of setting the new, more aggressive tone.
Absolutely. They were pushing the boundaries, breaking old taboos, and showing everyone else that this aggressive, highly leveraged approach was incredibly profitable. I mean, they often ranked as the most profitable publicly traded securities firm back then, sometimes hitting returns on equity of 30%. They helped redefine what was acceptable, what was possible in finance.
And as finance got more complex, more opaque, it also created opportunities for, manipulation deep inside the system, didn't it? Which kind of brings us to the LIBOR scandal. That was a shocker.
The LIBOR scandal was a perfect storm, exposing how traders like Tom Hayes could exploit the system's complexity. LIBOR, you'll remember, was supposed to be the average interest rate banks charged each other for short-term loans. It was set based on daily submissions from about 16 major banks. What Hayes did was use instant messages, chat rooms basically, to nudge colleagues at other banks. He'd ask them to tweak their LIBOR submissions slightly, maybe keep them flat, move them up a tiny bit, down a tiny bit, whatever helped his own trading positions in interest rate derivatives.
Well, for people listening who might not remember the details, why was this so hard for regulators or anyone on the outside to spot? It sounds blatant when you describe it now.
It seems blatant in hindsight, but is hidden in plain sight, really. First, the whole definition and oversight of LIBOR was incredibly fuzzy. It grew out of a kind of informal gentleman's agreement among banks, not strict rules. Second, the changes Hayes was asking for were tiny on any given day. We're talking basis points. And they weren't always in the same direction. One day he might want it a fraction higher, the next a fraction lower.
So it just looked like normal market noise.
Exactly. It was like trying to detect thousands of tiny, almost invisible adjustments across 16 different banks simultaneously, rather than one big, obvious heist. The combined effect over time was massive manipulation benefiting traders, but the day-to-day signals were just too small and scattered to raise immediate red flags.
And Hayes himself, his personal outcome kind of reflects the whole era, doesn't it? He made a fortune for his bank trading the stuff, but when the crash came.
Yeah, the irony is brutal. Hayes was apparently expecting a gigantic bonus, maybe $2.5 million or more, for the profits he generated that year. But then the financial crisis hit full force. His employer, UBS, suffered catastrophic losses and needed a massive $54 billion government bailout just to survive. So instead of the millions, Hayes' bonus got slashed down to $250,000. It's a stark reminder that even when individuals find ways to game the system for huge personal gain, the underlying systemic risks in that kind of high-stakes finance can come back and bite everyone, including the institution itself.
Okay, so we've got the founder's mindset, we've got the capital architecture. But the final piece, the highest level of this global Python playbook, seems to be about mastering state power. Realizing that just having money isn't enough. You either need to align directly with what the state wants, or you need to actively use the political and regulatory system to protect your empire. Let's start with maybe the clearest example of state endorsement today: China's rise as an AI superpower.
China's approach is really distinct because it's so explicitly state-driven. It makes China pretty much the only nation right now that can act as a genuine counterweight to the U.S. in these critical emerging technologies like AI. And a key moment was around 2014 when the Chinese government gave its first full-throated endorsement of internet entrepreneurship. That political signal, that green light, was like pouring gasoline on the fire for commercial tech growth.
And that government backing, plus China's unique conditions, dense cities, everyone using mobile phones for everything that created this incredibly rich data environment, right? What our sources call the world's richest real-world datascape.
Precisely. You had companies like Alibaba and Tencent just racing each other to digitize everything in urban life, paying bills, ordering food, renting bikes, buying train tickets. Every tiny transaction became a data point. And Tencent really nailed the final piece with WeChat Pay. They cleverly used those digital red envelopes during Chinese New Year, basically digital gift giving, to lure millions and millions of people into linking their bank accounts to the app. That move finalized the system where you could pay for absolutely anything with your phone.
So that cultural tradition, the red envelope, was actually a strategic masterstroke to lock in the financial plumbing for this massive data collection.
He was the linchpin, yeah. This incredibly deep level of digital payment penetration happening with the state's blessing, even encouragement, it generated an unparalleled real-time stream of data about what people were doing, buying, where they were going. And that kind of data is absolute gold for training the deep learning AI algorithms that power the next wave of tech. It's state power leveraged through commercial dominance to create a strategic national advantage.
Okay, so that's direct state partnership. Now, let's contrast that with how it often works in the US, where maybe it's less about partnership and more about aggressively using political influence and lobbying for what they call corporate defense. The Koch network seems like the textbook case here.
Yeah, the Koch story is fascinating because they didn't start out as political players. Initially, Charles and David Koch kind of looked down on conventional politics. They saw politicians, even conservatives like Reagan, as compromisers, as sellouts. They thought direct political engagement was sort of messy, maybe beneath them.
What changed their minds?
A big turning point was a serious Senate investigation into their company's environmental practices. That experience seems to have convinced them that they couldn't just ignore Washington. They realized they needed to build a proactive, systematic defense mechanism. The shift, as our sources put it, was driven by realizing that politics was about power and, crucially, about corporate defense, meaning actively working to block regulations or taxes that could hurt their massive industrial operations.
And that realization turned them into these huge players in conservative politics, building this whole network aimed specifically at shaping policy to protect their business interests. You really see that defensive posture when things like tax rules come up, like the carried interest loophole fight.
Oh, the reaction to trying to close the carried interest loophole was incredibly revealing. This, remember, is the tax break that lets private equity and hedge fund managers treat a large chunk of their earnings as capital gains, taxed at a much lower rate than ordinary income. When the Obama administration pushed to close it, the response from the financial elite was immediate and, frankly, ferocious. Stephen Schwartzman, the CEO of Blackstone, literally called the effort a war.
A war over a tax rule.
He didn't stop there. He made this incredibly charged comparison, saying it was like when Hitler invaded Poland in 1939.
Wow, that's
Uh,
extreme language. Why go that far?
well, the financial stakes were obviously enormous for the industry, but the language itself was clearly strategic. It was designed to be inflammatory, to shock, to generate maximum political pushback, and ultimately to scare lawmakers away from touching the loophole. It aimed to completely delegitimize the policy proposal. It just shows the absolute intensity with which these industries will fight to protect their established financial advantages using political theater as a weapon.
And political influence isn't just about stopping laws, it's also about access, isn't it? Getting the nod for key deals, maybe through subtle regulatory favor. The story of how Rupert Murdoch got the Sun newspaper in the UK seems like a little example of that.
It's a really interesting case study in how subtle influence can sometimes trump formal position. You had Robert Maxwell, who was not just a tycoon, but also a sitting member of Parliament, a real political insider. He tried twice to buy the Sun newspaper and failed both times. Yet, Rupert Murdoch, coming in from the outside, relatively speaking, succeeded.
Why? Maxwell apparently thought it was because the British establishment just didn't like him.
That was Maxwell's take, yeah. Whether it was prejudice or something else, the point is, Murdoch clearly had cultivated the right connections, the necessary quiet support from key figures, maybe regulators, maybe powerful insiders, to get the deal done where Maxwell, despite his formal political role, couldn't. It suggests that sometimes it's not about knowing the official rules, it's about knowing and maybe influencing the gatekeepers.
Okay, so influence matters. But let's go back to the original playbook for raw power. Just controlling the essential infrastructure. That's how someone like Cornelius Vanderbilt became this overwhelming force, right? He wasn't a politician, but he had immense sway over public affairs.
Vanderbilt was something new, a new creature, as one source calls him. His power didn't come from holding office or commanding armies. It came from mastering two modern tools: the corporation as a legal entity and the stock market as a way to consolidate control. He used these brilliantly to gain absolute dominance over the channels of commerce. He figured out how to use marketplace to centralize capital and basically control the fate of vital railroads, especially the routes connecting the country, like the one to California.
So by controlling the tracks, he controlled the flow of everything.
Pretty much. Goods, people, information, the lifeblood of the growing nation's economy. That gave him a kind of power that few politicians at the time even understood, let alone knew how to counter. The language and tools of politics just hadn't caught up to the scale of economic power he represented.
And that idea of having power that's almost totally unchecked, independent of democratic processes, you see that maybe in its purest non-business form with someone like Robert Moses in New York.
Moses is the ultimate example of building power through controlling public works and manipulating bureaucratic authority. He wasn't elected to his most powerful positions. His strategy was to accumulate authority over parks, bridges, tunnels, highways. And he showed just how untouchable he became with that infamous Northern State Parkway detour incident.
Right, the one involving the wealthy estates.
Exactly. The wealthy barons in the Wheatley Hills area on Long Island didn't want the new parkway running near their mansions, so Moses just moved it. He agreed to reroute the highway 2 miles south to accommodate them. But the kicker was, who paid for it?
Let me guess, not the barons.
Hardly. The detour cost the taxpayers of New York State $2.25 million, a huge sum back then. The barons, they contributed only $175,000. It was at that point, our sources say, that reformers realized Moses had amassed so much power through his control of public authorities that he was now absolutely untrammeled. He simply didn't have to care what elected officials or the public thought anymore. He demonstrated that by mastering the levers of public authority, not private capital, in his case he could impose his vision, even when it was wildly expensive or went directly against the public interest. His power became absolute within his domain. Hashtag check outro. So you've looked at the founders, the finance, the politics. What's the big picture here? When you put all these pieces together, what does this deep dive really tell us about how these colossal successes happen? Well, it seems pretty clear that getting to that level, that kind of long-term, world-shaping success, it's never just about having a good idea or working hard, is it? It really relies on this very specific, potent mix. You need that visionary, often kind of extreme zeal, whether it's the relentless penny pinching of a Sam Walton or the, almost reckless ambition of a Howard Hughes.
Right, that drive. But it has to be paired with something else.
Exactly. It has to be coupled with real tactical skill in finance, a certain audacity. Think Rockefeller manipulating the banks, or Blackstone timing the market perfectly, or even the willingness sometimes to just burn cash for years and years to achieve massive scale before worrying about profit.
And then the final layer, the political game.
And that's critical. It demands this sharp, maybe even ruthless understanding of how to use the political and regulatory system to your advantage. Either you align with state goals, like in China, or you actively shape the rules, like the Koch network does with corporate defense. The common thread, really, is playing the long game, using immense scale, leveraging capital, getting tangled up in politics, sometimes pushing ethical boundaries or manipulating institutions, all to achieve this unprecedented level of dominance that ends up shaping not just markets, but, governance itself.
It really shatters that simple myth of the lone genius founder, doesn't it? When you see the reality, the obsessive operational control of Walton, the aggressive political maneuvering of the Kochs purely for defense, it's a much more complex and maybe darker picture.
Which brings us back to that core question about the cost, doesn't it? We've seen these examples. Musk's manufactured crises, Gucci's financial implosion, the outright fraud at Theranos. Does chasing that high gross, like Hume's, or aiming for true global domination, does that path almost inevitably require a playbook that includes, internal pressure tactics that border on brutality, huge financial risks, deep political entanglement?
Yeah, when does that visionary ambition stop being a driver of innovation and start becoming a danger, a liability to society? Is it even possible to reach that kind of impact, that scale, without embracing at least some degree of ruthlessness?
That's probably the question to leave you with. Something to think about as you watch these corporate empires continue to shape the world all around us.